Rain has a way of finding the cracks in you before it finds the cracks in anything else. That's what I remember most about the night I arrived at Bishop Hall. Not the gate, not the gravel crunching under the taxi's tires, not even the size of the house swallowing the horizon like it had swallowed 100 years of storms before mine. I remember the rain sliding down the collar of my coat and thinking, this is either the beginning of something or the end of me. SS. I had one suitcase, a folder of teaching credentials that were only half true, and a heartbeat that hadn't settled since the letter from the agency arrived 3 weeks earlier. Bishop family, private tutor required. Live-in, discretion, essential. Discretion. That word alone should have warned me. Rich families don't ask for discretion unless they have something worth hiding, and I have always had a talent for finding exactly the wrong thing to hide inside of. The housekeeper who let me in had a face carved from patience, the kind that comes from serving people who never say thank you. She told me my room was on the 3rd floor, East Wing, and that Master Bishop would see me in the morning. I remember thinking, masters was a strange word for a country that had stopped using it 100 years ago, and then I remembered what kind of family lived in a house like this. Old blood doesn't update its vocabulary. It just builds higher walls. I didn't sleep. I lay in a bed big enough for 4 of me and listened to the house breathe. Old wood settling. Wind finding gaps in stone that had stood since before my grandparents were born. And I thought about the reason I had taken this job in the first place. Not the money, though the money was obscene. Not the prestige, though the bishop name opened doors that could get a person anywhere in the world. I had taken it because 6 months earlier my life had become a house on fire, and Bishop Hall was simply the farthest exit I could find. I am an Omega. I say that plainly because the world never lets me say it plainly. It's always whispered, apologized for, tucked behind a closed door like a stain nobody wants to admit is on the carpet. In most places, that fact alone determines the shape of your future before you've had the chance to choose one. I had spent 26 years refusing to let it determine mine. I had a degree in literature, a second in economic history, 3 languages, and a stubbornness that had gotten me fired from 2 prestigious tutoring positions for refusing to be quiet when quiet was expected of me. Bishop Hall was supposed to be my 4th attempt at proving that an Omega could be more than a womb with good manners. I did not know that first rain-soaked night, that within a year, I would be carrying the answer to a question the entire Bishop dynasty had been asking for 3 generations. An heir, finally. From a lineage half the world assumed was cursed to end. I did not know that the man who would put that question to rest would also be the reason I packed a single suitcase again and tried to vanish into a country where no one had ever heard the name Bishop. I only knew that first night that the house was too quiet, the rain was too loud, and somewhere down a hallway I hadn't yet walked, a man was about to become the center of gravity my whole life would orbit. Fernando Bishop did not introduce himself. He simply appeared in the doorway of the study at exactly 8 the next morning, dressed like the day had already tried and failed to inconvenience him, and looked at me the way a man looks at a ledger he suspects doesn't balance. "You're smaller than the file suggested," he said, which was not a greeting so much as an audit. "The file didn't mention my height," I said. "I assume it mentioned my qualifications." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite amusement, more like the flicker of a man recalibrating an assumption. He was younger than I expected for someone who ran an empire people spoke of in the same breath as governments. 30, maybe 31. Dark hair kept short and deliberate, a jaw that looked like it had been designed by someone with a grudge against softness, and eyes, the color of the ocean an hour before a storm. Gray-green, restless, giving nothing away for free. "You'll be tutoring my nephew," he said. "Theodore. He's 12, he's brilliant, and he knows it, which makes him insufferable. His last 4 tutors quit." "Why?" "Because he's brilliant and he knows it," Fernando repeated, as if that answered everything, which, I would learn, it usually did. I asked him what subjects Theodore needed most. He told me mathematics, but really, he meant attention. Though it took me another 2 weeks to understand what he wasn't saying, that Theodor's parents were dead, that the boy had been raised by staff and inherited weight instead of warmth, and that Fernando himself, the eldest, the one who had taken the family's crown at 24 when his own father collapsed in a boardroom and never stood up again, barely had time to breathe, let alone parent a child who wasn't technically his, to parent. I didn't fall for him in that first conversation. I want to be honest about that because so many stories like mine pretend it happens all at once, a single unbearable moment of recognition. It wasn't like that. What happened in that first conversation was smaller and more dangerous than falling. I got curious. I wanted to know what was underneath the audit ledger's stare. I wanted to know why a man who ran a dynasty spoke about a 12-year-old's loneliness like it was a business problem he hadn't solved yet, and why, underneath the coldness of the phrasing, I could hear something that sounded almost like guilt. Curiosity, in my experience, is the door alphas like Fernando Bishop use to get into places they were never invited. Theodore was, as promised, insufferable, and within a week, I loved him a little, the way you love anyone who is trying that hard to prove they don't need anyone at all. He corrected my grammar in Latin phrases he'd taught himself out of spite for a previous tutor. He asked me questions designed to embarrass me and then looked disappointed when I answered them correctly. He did not, for the first 4 days, say a single word that wasn't a test. On the 5th day, it rained again. This house seemed built out of rain stacked stone on stone until the sky itself felt like part of the architecture. And Theodore came to the study early before our lesson and sat across from me with his knees pulled to his chest. "Do you think my uncle hates having me here?" he asked, not looking at me. I told him no. I told him that some people show love by making sure the roof doesn't leak rather than by saying the word out loud, and that from what I'd seen, Fernando Bishop had spent an alarming amount of money making sure this particular roof never leaked on this particular boy. Theodore didn't smile, but something in his shoulders came down half an inch, which, for a boy raised by staff and inherited weight, was as good as a smile. I started seeing Fernando more after that, not because the job required it, but because Theodore had a habit of dragging his uncle into the study under increasingly thin pretenses, and Fernando, despite an empire's worth of demands on his hours, kept coming. I watched him sit at the edge of a desk built for a child and listen to Theodore recite a poem in 3 languages with the same intensity he probably brought to boardrooms worth more than small countries. I watched the ledger look soften, just slightly, every single time. It was in the 4th week that I understood the danger I was in. Fernando had come to collect Theodore for dinner, and the boy had run ahead to wash his hands, leaving the 2 of us alone in a study lit gold by a dying afternoon. "He likes you," Fernando said. "He hasn't liked anyone since his mother." "I like him too," I said. "He's fierce. He reminds me of someone I used to be." "Who's that?" I hadn't meant to say it. It slipped out before I could build a wall in front of it. Someone who thought if they were smart enough, no one would notice what else they were. Fernando looked at me for a long moment, long enough that the gold light had time to move an inch across the floor between us, and said quiet enough that it didn't feel like an audit at all. "I notice anyway. It doesn't change anything I think of you." I have replayed that sentence more times than I can count. At the time I told myself it meant nothing, that a man like Fernando Bishop said careful, generous things to staff the way other men said, "Thank you for holding the door." It took me much longer to understand that Fernando Bishop did not say careful things by accident. Every sentence he built was load-bearing. He had simply built that one to hold more weight than I was ready for. There is a particular kind of alpha the world warns omegas about. The kind whose presence changes the air pressure in a room, who doesn't so much enter a space as annex it. Fernando was not that kind, not exactly. His authority didn't announce itself. It simply existed, the way gravity exists, invisible until you tried to walk away from it and found yourself pulled back regardless. By the 2nd month, I had stopped pretending the pull wasn't happening. It showed itself in small increments. He began finding reasons to walk me to the East Wing after Theodore's lessons ran late. Reasons that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with wanting 5 more minutes of conversation. He wouldn't admit to wanting. I began finding reasons to linger in doorways he was likely to pass through, telling myself it was coincidence, knowing it wasn't. We built an entire relationship out of plausible deniability, two people circling something neither of us had permission to name. The first time he touched me, really touched me, not the accidental brush of hands passing a book, was during a storm that knocked out half the estate's power. I had gone looking for candles in a house I still didn't fully know, and found him instead in a hallway lit only by the strobing flash of lightning through tall windows, looking for the same thing. "You're not afraid of storms," he said. It wasn't a question. Alphas like Fernando rarely ask questions when they could make declarations instead. "I grew up in a flat with a roof that leaked every time it rained," I said. "Storms stopped being frightening once I understood they were just weather doing what weather does. It's people who frighten me." "Have I frightened you?" The lightning caught his face at an angle that stripped away every careful, controlled thing about him. And for one unguarded second, I saw something that looked almost like fear itself. The fear of a man who has spent his whole life being obeyed and has just realized obedience is not the same thing as being wanted. "No," I said. "You've done something worse. You've made me curious." He reached out then and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear, a gesture so small it shouldn't have undone me the way it did. His hand lingered against my jaw, warm despite the storm-cooled air, and I felt something in my chest crack open like a window finally letting weather in after being sealed too long. "I have spent my whole life being told what I owe this family," he said. "I have never once been asked what I want. What do you want?" He didn't answer with words. He answered by closing the distance between us and kissing me, the way a man kisses something he has been forbidden and has decided finally to take anyway. Not rough, not desperate, but certain. The way water is certain when it finally finds the crack it's been looking for. I should have stopped it. I was staff. He was my employer, the head of a dynasty. An alpha with the kind of power that could make an omega's consent complicated in ways neither of us wanted to examine too closely. But in that hallway, in that storm, none of that mattered as much as the simple, terrifying fact that I wanted him back with a hunger I had spent years pretending I didn't have the right to feel. We were careful, at first. Careful the way people are careful when they know a thing is fragile and dangerous and worth protecting anyway. Stolen hours after Tutor was asleep. Conversations that ran until 3 in the morning about nothing and everything, his father's death. My own family's quiet disapproval of a son who refused to be ashamed of what he was. The strange loneliness of running an empire that had never once asked him if he wanted the crown. He told me things he had never told anyone, he said. And I believed him, because Fernando Bishop did not waste words on things that weren't true. I told him things I had buried under years of proving myself twice as hard as any beta or alpha in every room I'd ever walked into. How tired I was of being underestimated before I'd said a single sentence. How much I wanted just once to be seen as a whole person instead of a category with an asterisk. "You are the most whole person I have ever met," he told me one night, in the dark, with my head against his chest and his heartbeat steady under my ear like something I could set a clock by. "I don't know how you managed it, growing up in a world built to convince you otherwise." "Spite," I said, and felt him laugh. A low rumble I felt more than heard. It would have been easy to stay careful. It would have been the wise thing, the survivable thing. But an alpha and omega who have spent months circling each other in a house full of watching staff and older cousins with old-fashioned opinions do not stay careful forever. Not when the pull between them has stopped being curiosity and started being something closer to gravity's true name. The night my heat came early, weeks ahead of schedule, triggered, I would later understand, by proximity to him, by months of suppressants fighting a losing battle against wanting someone specific instead of wanting no one at all. Fernando did not treat it as an opportunity. He treated it the way he treated everything that mattered to him, seriously, deliberately, and with a tenderness that undid me more than any storm ever had. "Tell me to leave and I will," he said, at my door, scent thick with concern layered over the low burn of an alpha's own instincts straining against restraint. "I mean that. I will stand outside this door all night if that's what you need." "I don't want you outside the door," I told him, and meant it with every unraveling part of me. "What happened after belongs to the two of us alone, and I won't hand it over to anyone else, not even in the retelling. I will say only that it was not the desperate, instinct-driven thing the world tells stories about when it talks about heats and alphas and the chemistry between them. It was slow, it was reverent. It was Fernando Bishop, a man who ran an empire with clinical precision, taking his time to make sure every part of me understood for the first time in my life what it felt like to be wanted instead of simply had. Neither of us said the word love that night, but I think we both knew, somewhere underneath the exhaustion in the tangled sheets and the gray dawn light finding its way through the curtains, that we had crossed into territory from which there was no clean way back. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with zero ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. I found out I was pregnant on an ordinary Thursday, in the kind of quiet way that made the news feel almost gentle before it became terrifying. I had been tired for weeks, tired in a way that suppressants and long nights with Fernando didn't fully explain. And when the estate's discreet physician, a woman with kind eyes and a mouth trained not to show surprise at anything, told me the result, I sat very still and listened to my own heartbeat like it belonged to someone else. Carrying. That was the word she used, gentle and clinical at once, carrying the way a river carries water downstream, inevitable, unstoppable, indifferent to whether the banks were ready. I did not tell Fernando immediately. I want to be honest about that too, because it is the hinge on which everything after turned. I sat with the knowledge alone for 4 days, walking the grounds of Bishop Hall in the cold, turning the fact over and over like a stone I couldn't skip across water no matter how many times I tried. I understood, better than most, what this pregnancy meant to a family like his. The Bishop dynasty had been circling extinction for 3 generations, a bloodline thinned by tragedy by a grandfather who outlived 2 sons by a father who died before he could see his own grandson be born by Fernando himself. 31 and unmarried, and increasingly regarded by cousins and board members alike as a man who had sacrificed his personal life for the company and had nothing left over to produce an heir. I had heard the whispers in the staff corridors. I had heard the way certain relatives said the word heir, like a prayer they'd stopped believing would be answered. And here I was, the tutor, the Omega hired to teach a nephew Latin, carrying the answer to 3 generations of prayers. It should have felt like triumph. It felt instead like a trapdoor opening beneath me, because I understood something else too, something I had understood since the moment the bishop name first appeared on that agency letter. Dynasties do not exist to serve the people who happen to be carrying their futures. Dynasties consume. I had watched it happen to Fernando himself, watched a boy become a company because a company needed him to. I had no illusions about what would happen to me, to us, HW. Once the family's lawyers and cousins and board members understood that the heir they'd been praying for was growing inside an Omega tutor with no name, no fortune, and no family influential enough to protect him from being managed, contained, or quietly removed once his usefulness was fulfilled. I loved Fernando. That was never in question, not for one single second of what came after. But loving him did not erase what I knew about the machine he belonged to. And I had learned a long time ago that love is not always enough to survive a machine built to protect itself above everything else, including the people inside it. I told him on a Sunday in the greenhouse at the far edge of the property, because it was the one place in that entire enormous house that felt like it belonged to no one's ledger but the plants growing wild in it. He knew something was wrong before I said a word. Alphas always do, especially ones as attuned to me as Fernando had become over those months, and he crossed the space between us with the particular urgency of a man bracing for bad news. "I'm pregnant," I said, because I had never learned how to soften hard truths, only how to survive delivering them plainly. Silence stretched long enough that I started composing, in my head, all the ways this could go wrong. But when Fernando finally spoke, his voice cracked in a place I had never heard it crack before. "Say that again." "I'm pregnant, Fernando. It's yours. There's been no one else." He crossed the last few feet between us and took my face in both hands, like something he was afraid might shatter. And when I looked into his eyes, I did not see the calculation I had braced for. The dynasty math, the succession, planning the cold arithmetic of an empire finally getting what it needed. I saw a man undone by something that had nothing to do with business at all. "You're carrying my child," he said, wonder threading through every word like he was testing whether the sentence was real by saying it out loud. "I am." "Then marry me." It came out of him too fast, too raw to be the calculated proposal a Bishop Heir was supposed to make. It sounded instead like a man grabbing for the only solid thing in a room that had just tilted sideways. And even in the middle of my own fear, something in me softened at how unguarded he looked saying it. "Fernando, I know how this sounds," he said before I could finish. "I know it sounds like the company talking. It isn't. I have loved you since before I let myself admit it, since long before this happened. This just means I don't have any more excuses to wait." I wanted, desperately, to believe him. And in that greenhouse, surrounded by things growing wild and unmanaged, I did believe him. I believed every unguarded word. What I did not yet know how to believe was that his family, his board, his cousins with their old-fashioned opinions and their careful eyes, would let a love this uncalculated survive contact with the machine they had all built their lives around protecting. I said yes. God help me, I said yes with my whole unguarded heart. I did not yet know how quickly that yes would be tested by people who had never once, in 3 generations, let love outrank the dynasty's need to survive. Word travels fast in houses built to keep secrets, and faster still when the secret is an heir. Within 2 weeks of Fernando's proposal, Bishop Hall filled with relatives I had only ever heard about in careful guarded staff corridor whispers. Fernando's aunt Isolde, who ran the family's legal affairs with a precision that made lawyers nervous. His cousin Marcus, whose ambitions for the company's future had never quite included a version where Fernando's line continued rather than his own. A rotating cast of board members whose smiles never once reached their eyes when they looked at me. They were, without exception, polite. Politeness, I would learn, was simply the Bishop family's preferred weapon. Softer than cruelty, more precise, and infinitely more difficult to fight because it never gave you anything solid to push back against. "How wonderful," Isolde said, the first time she met me, her eyes moving over me with the clinical thoroughness of someone appraising livestock. "The family has needed good news for so long." "You must be very proud," Marcus said at dinner, in a tone that suggested pride was the last thing he felt. "Carrying on the Bishop name is no small thing. I do hope you understand the weight of it." I understood the weight of it better than any of them, because I was the one carrying it. Literally, physically, in a body they had already begun discussing like a vessel rather than a person. I heard, within the first month, whispers about contracts, about non-disclosure agreements, about whether the tutor, they rarely used my name, I noticed always the tutor, as though a title could be substituted for a person, should be given a formal position within the household appropriate to his new significance, or whether it would be simpler, cleaner for everyone's sake to arrange a quiet settlement once the child was born and let the tutor return to whatever obscure life he'd come from. Fernando fought for me in every room I wasn't allowed into. I know that now, though I did not always know it then, in the thick of my own fear. He fired a board advisor who suggested in a closed meeting that a paternity dispute might be easier to manage than a wedding. He told his aunt Isolde in words the staff repeated to me in hushed, half-admiring tones, that anyone who spoke about the Omega carrying his child, as though I were a liability rather than the person he loved would no longer have a place in Bishop Hall. But I had grown up learning to read rooms the way other people read books, and what I read in that house, underneath every careful smile and every congratulation, was a family that saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be welcomed. And the more I watched Fernando fight for me, the more I began to understand a truth I hadn't wanted to face. Every battle he won for my sake cost him something with his own family, something I would never be able to fully repay, something that might eventually cost him the very dynasty he had spent his whole life protecting. I had come to Bishop Hall to disappear into someone else's world for a while. I began to understand in those weeks that staying might mean I disappeared into it for good, not the way I had planned, but the way rivers disappear into oceans, losing every feature that had once made them recognizably themselves. She came to me alone 3 weeks before the date Fernando had set for our wedding, a private ceremony, small, his choice entirely, made in defiance of every relative who wanted the bishop heir's arrival to be a public spectacle instead of a quiet joy. Isolde found me in the library, where I had taken to spending afternoons because it was the one room in the house that still felt like it belonged to books rather than bloodlines. And she sat across from me with the particular calm of a woman who has never once had to raise her voice to get what she wants. "You love him," she said, "not a question." The bishops, I had learned, rarely asked questions when a declaration would do. "I do." Then you understand what love like that costs a man in his position. I said nothing, because I did understand, more than she knew, and I was tired of pretending otherwise for the sake of politeness in a house that had never once extended me the same courtesy. "The board will not accept an unnamed tutor as the mother of the next bishop heir," she said, plainly, the way a surgeon describes a diagnosis. "Not without a fight that will take years and cost the company more than you can imagine. Years Fernando doesn't have, not with the merger negotiations already underway, not with cousins circling for any excuse to challenge his leadership. I am not telling you this to be cruel. I am telling you because I don't think anyone else in this house has had the courage to be honest with you." "What are you offering?" Her offer was simple and generous by any measure that didn't involve love. A settlement large enough to build an entirely new life anywhere in the world. Medical care through the pregnancy under a different name, complete anonymity. And this was the part that finally cracked something loose in my chest. Full custody rights waived quietly, discreetly, so that once the child was born, the bishop family could raise the heir without the complication of a Tutor-turned-scandal attached to the story. "You want me to disappear," I said. "I want you to survive," she said. And for one unguarded moment, something that might have been sympathy moved across her face. "This family does not forgive weakness, and it will not forgive Fernando's for long, no matter how much he loves you. I have watched 3 generations of bishops try to choose love over duty. I have watched all 3 of them lose. I am trying to make sure you don't lose everything alongside him." I did not accept her offer that day, but I did not refuse it either, and that silence, that terrible, cowardly silence, was the first crack in the foundation I would eventually build my disappearance on. I did not tell Fernando about Isolde's visit. I told myself it was to protect him from another battle in a war he was already losing pieces of himself to fight. The truth, which took me much longer to admit, was simpler and less noble. I was afraid that if I told him, he would ask me to stay. And I was afraid of how badly I wanted to say yes, even though every instinct I'd built over 26 years of surviving as an Omega in a world unkind to us was screaming that staying would cost me everything, eventually, my name, my independence, my sense of being a whole person rather than a vessel for someone else's legacy. The weeks that followed were the happiest and most terrifying of my life, folded together so tightly I couldn't always tell where one ended and the other began. Fernando was gentler with me than I had ever seen him be with anyone, including Theodore, including himself. He rested his hand against the growing curve of my stomach every night, like he was memorizing something he was terrified of losing. He told me in low voices in the dark all the things he wanted for our child. Not company shares, not board seats, not the crushing weight of the bishop name, but simple things, ordinary things. The freedom to choose a life that wasn't already written before they were born. I don't want them to inherit what I inherited, he told me once, his voice raw, in a way I had learned meant he was saying something he'd never said out loud before. I want them to inherit a father who chose them over everything else, the way no one ever chose that for me. I believed him. I believe him still, even now, even after everything. But belief and safety are not the same thing, and every kindness he gave me in private came wrapped in a public world that had made its verdict on me clear the moment my pregnancy became a fact instead of a rumor. The board tried twice to introduce clauses into a prenuptial agreement that would have given the family legal authority over the child's upbringing in the event of, the phrasing was chillingly clinical, any instability in the primary caregiving relationship. Marcus, Fernando's cousin, began quietly cultivating relationships with board members who might, someday, find it useful to challenge the legitimacy of an heir born to an Omega, with no family name to leverage. Even the staff, kind as most of them were, had started treating me with a delicate, careful distance. The distance people use around something breakable, or something they suspect won't be staying long enough to be worth getting close to. I began to understand that Isolde had not lied to me. This family did not forgive weakness, and love, in a house built entirely around the machinery of Dynasty, was treated as the ultimate weakness, a variable no spreadsheet could account for, a risk no merger negotiation could hedge against. And I began to understand something about myself too. Something that frightened me more than any board meeting or prenuptial clause ever could. I did not know how to be loved inside a system built to consume the people it claimed to protect. I had spent my entire life being strong specifically because no one had ever built a system to protect me. I did not know what it meant to let someone else's world absorb mine, and every day I stayed in Bishop Hall. I felt myself disappearing a little further into a story that was never fully going to be mine. The Omega Tutor, the vessel, the footnote in a dynasty's long self-mythologizing history. The night I decided to leave Fernando was in Geneva, closing the merger that had consumed 6 months of his life. And Bishop Hall was quiet, in the particular way houses are quiet when their master is somewhere else and everyone in them is holding their breath, waiting for him to come home. I sat in the greenhouse. Our greenhouse, the place where I'd told him about the pregnancy. The place that had always felt like the one corner of that enormous house that belonged to no one's ledger, and I made a list. The way I make lists whenever I need to convince myself a terrifying decision is actually a rational one. I love him. That was the first line, because it was true, and because everything after it needed to be measured against that truth to mean anything at all. He cannot protect me from his own family without destroying himself in the process. Tack. That was the second line, and I believed it completely, having watched him spend 6 months absorbing blow after blow meant for me watch the toll it took in the tightness around his eyes. The new gray threading through hair that had been uniformly dark when I met him less than a year before. The child deserves a father who isn't at war with his own bloodline. That was the line that broke me, because I understood, sitting there with my hand on the curve of my stomach, that I was not just protecting myself anymore. I was trying to protect someone who didn't yet have a voice to say what they wanted, someone who would grow up inside a war I had, however unintentionally, started simply by existing. If I disappear now, before the wedding, before the board can build a case against him, Fernando keeps the company his father built, keeps the family he spent his whole life sacrificing for, and eventually, heals. FCS. I did not write down the truest line, the one underneath all the others, because I was too afraid to look directly at it even in the privacy of my own handwriting. I don't believe I'm allowed to have this. I have never once, in my entire life, believed I was allowed to have something this good. And some part of me is more comfortable losing it on my own terms than waiting for someone else to take it from me first. I packed one suitcase, the same size as the one I'd arrived with, because there is a particular symmetry to grief that insists on returning you to where you started. I withdrew nothing from Isolde's offer. Some stubborn, wounded part of me refused to take money from a woman who had called me a liability, even as I did precisely what she had asked me to do. I left instead in the dead of night, with what little I had earned as a tutor, a fake name I had already arranged through a contact from my old life, and a plane ticket to a country far enough away that the bishop name would mean nothing to anyone I met there. I left a letter for Fernando. I have never been able to remember word for word what I wrote in it, only the feeling of writing it, the particular, specific agony of trying to explain a love so large it had convinced me the only way to protect it was to destroy it myself. I told Tutor goodbye without telling him it was goodbye, because I could not bear to watch a 12-year-old boy who had already lost too many people understand he was about to lose one more. And then I disappeared, the way I had told myself, in a different life, in a different letter 3 weeks earlier, that a person like me was always destined to. This part of the story does not belong to me alone. Fernando told me much later, everything that happened in those first hours after he came home from Geneva to a house gone silent in exactly the wrong way, and I have carried his account of it ever since, folded into my memory alongside my own, because I think a story like ours only makes sense when it's told from both sides of the silence. He said he knew before he even reached the greenhouse. He said the house had a different quality to it, an absence with weight, the particular emptiness of a space where someone has recently stopped being present. He found my letter on the desk in our room, and he read it standing up still in the coat he'd worn off the plane. And by the time he reached the last line, his hands were shaking too badly to hold the paper steady. He did not, he told me later, feel angry. Not at first. He felt something closer to drowning the specific panic of a man who has spent his whole life mastering every variable in every room he's ever walked into, discovering all at once that the one variable that mattered most had walked out a door he hadn't thought to guard. He called every contact he had. He grounded 3 private jets before dawn, trying to trace which airport I might have used. He woke Isolde at 4 in the morning, and according to the housekeeper who overheard it from the hallway, said things to his aunt that no one in that family had ever heard him say to anyone, let alone the woman who had run its legal affairs for 2 decades. You did this, he told her. It wasn't a question. You told him he wasn't safe here. You made him believe leaving was protecting me. Isolde, to her credit. And I have had a long time to decide whether she deserves credit, and I have settled, finally, on a complicated yes course, did not deny it. I told him the truth, she said. This family has never once let love survive intact. I was trying to make sure at least one of you did. You should have let that be my choice, Fernando told her, and the housekeeper said his voice broke on the last word in a way she had never once heard it break, not even at his own father's funeral. You should have let him choose. He didn't run from me. He ran from a version of this family that made him believe I couldn't protect what mattered most. That's not you protecting anyone. That's you deciding, for both of us, that we didn't deserve to try. He spent the next 3 days barely sleeping, chasing every lead he had. Old agency contacts, a cousin of mine, he tracked down through records I hadn't thought to hide. The fake name I had used for the flight, which turned out to be less untraceable than my old contact had promised. He told the board in a meeting the staff described to me later with something close to awe that he did not care what it cost the company or his own standing within it. He was finding the father of his child, and anyone who tried to stop him could explain to the shareholders why the Bishop Heir's father had walked out the front door of Bishop Hall unpursued. I did not know any of this while it was happening. I only knew that I had landed in a small coastal town in a country where no one had ever heard of dynasties or mergers or heirs, and that I had rented a single room above a bakery that smelled like bread every morning, and that I sat by a window every evening watching a sea that had nothing to do with the storms I'd left behind. And I told myself over and over that I had done the right thing. I did not yet know how wrong I was. I only knew that my hand kept finding its way unconsciously to the curve of my stomach, and that every time it did, I felt the particular grief of loving someone so much, you convince yourself the kindest thing you can do is disappear from their life entirely. I want to tell you about those 6 weeks honestly, because they were not the noble, quietly heroic exile I had imagined when I packed that suitcase. They were lonely in a way I had not fully prepared for lonely, with a specific gnawing ache that had nothing to do with missing luxury and everything to do with missing a particular set of hands. A particular low voice in the dark. A particular way Fernando used to rest his palm flat against my stomach like he was keeping something precious anchored to the earth. I found work at the bakery downstairs kneading dough with hands that used to correct Latin declensions. And the woman who owned it, a widow named Consuela, who never once asked the questions I could see forming behind her eyes every time I flinched at the sound of an expensive car passing on the street below. Let me work in exchange for the room and enough food to keep me and the pregnancy healthy. I told myself every single morning that this was the life I had chosen, and that choosing it meant I had to learn to want it. I did not want it. I want to be honest about that too. Even now, even years later, I missed him with a physical ache that made some mornings feel like trying to breathe through wet cloth. I missed the way he used to read over my shoulder in the library, quietly correcting nothing, simply present. I missed Tutor's insufferable Latin phrases and the particular way his face lit up on the rare occasions I made him laugh, instead of just impressed. I missed a house I had spent months resenting for the way it made me feel small. And I understood, in the missing, that what I had actually resented was never the house itself. It was a family's failure to make room for me inside it. Fernando himself had never once failed to make room. I had left the man who loved me because I could not separate him, in my exhausted, frightened mind, from the machine surrounding him. The child moved for the first time on a Tuesday evening. I remember that detail sharply, the specific ordinariness of a Tuesday. Because I had spent so long imagining this story would begin or end on some more dramatic day, and instead, it announced itself in the most unremarkable way possible. A small fluttering pressure low in my stomach while I sat at the window watching fishing boats come in against a setting sun. I pressed both hands flat against myself and wept. Not from sadness exactly, though sadness was tangled in it, but from the overwhelming specific grief of experiencing something so enormous entirely alone. When the person I most wanted beside me was an ocean and a lifetime of fear away. I did not know that Tuesday evening that Fernando had by then narrowed his search to 3 coastal towns in the region I had fled to. Having finally traced the fake name back through a contact who owed my old university connections, a favor they could not refuse. I did not know that within 4 days, a car with no company markings, driven by a man who had learned the hard way that some things could not be delegated to security teams, would pull up outside a small bakery that smelled of bread every morning. I only knew that Tuesday evening that I had made a mistake I did not yet have the courage to name, and that somewhere far away, a man I loved more than I had ever let myself admit was tearing his own carefully controlled world apart, trying to find me. He found me on a Saturday in the late afternoon, flour still on my hands from the day's last batch of bread, and when the bell above the bakery door rang and I looked up expecting Consuela's regular customers, I instead saw Fernando Bishop standing in the doorway looking like a man who had not slept properly in 6 weeks, and did not care who witnessed the state he'd let himself fall into to get there. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. The bakery had gone quiet around us. Consuela, bless her, had the good sense to usher out the last customer and flip the sign on the door to closed without either of us asking. "You're supposed to be in Geneva," I finally said, because my mind, faced with the enormity of him actually standing there, had reached for the smallest, most useless observation available. "The merger closed 3 weeks ago," he said. "I have spent every day since then looking for you." "Fernando?" "Don't," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I had heard only once before, the night I told him I was pregnant, in a greenhouse that felt impossibly far away now. "Don't apologize yet. Let me say something first, because I have had 6 weeks to build this sentence, and I am not going to let myself lose my nerve. He crossed the bakery floor until he was close enough that I could see up close exactly how badly those 6 weeks had worn on him, the new lines at the corners of his eyes. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been running on nothing but panic and determination for far too long. "I let my family make you believe you weren't safe with me," he said. "I was so focused on fighting them in every room you weren't allowed into that I never stopped to ask whether you needed me fighting beside you. Instead, where you could see it, I let you carry the weight of protecting Mech from my own family when it should have always been the other way around. That is my failure, Daryl, not yours. You didn't run from me. I let you believe you had to run to save me from myself." Hearing my own name, my actual name, not the Tutor's, not the Omega carrying the Heir, just Daryl, said the way he used to say it in the dark, like it was something precious rather than a category, broke something open in my chest that I had spent 6 weeks trying to keep sealed shut. "I was scared," I said, "and the admission cost me everything I had left. I have spent my whole life being strong because no one ever built a world soft enough to let me be anything else. I didn't know how to trust that your world could hold both of us without one of us disappearing into it. I still don't know, Fernando. That fear didn't go away just because you found me." "Then let me build a different world," he said, and reached for my hand, flower and all, unwashed, unglamorous, exactly as I was, and held it like it was the single most important thing he had ever touched. "Not the one my family built, not the one that made you believe you were a liability instead of the person I love most in this world. A new one. One where you're never asked to disappear for anyone's sake ever again. Not mine, not the company's, not our child's. I would rather lose the entire dynasty than lose you a second time." I have never, before or since, heard a man dismantle everything he'd been raised to protect with such calm, total certainty. I did not go back to Bishop Hall that day, or the next, or the one after that. Fernando stayed in that small coastal town for 2 full weeks, sleeping in a rented room above the bakery 2 doors down from mine, working from a laptop balanced on a tiny table, while Consuela fed him bread he clearly didn't have the appetite to properly appreciate, and slowly, patiently, letting me set the pace of a trust that had been badly broken and needed rebuilding from something more solid than a single dramatic reunion. We talked, in those 2 weeks, more honestly than we had in the entire year before. He told me things about the board's pressure that he had shielded me from thinking he was protecting me, and I told him things about the fear I carried into every room built for people richer and more powerful than I had ever been allowed to feel. We built, slowly, in a rented room above a bakery, the kind of partnership that had been impossible to build inside a house designed to keep certain truths carefully, politely unsaid. "I spoke to Isolde before I left," he told me one night, "the 2 of us tangled together in a bed too small for the size of what we were rebuilding. I told her that if the board wanted an heir, they would get one raised by 2 parents who chose each other freely in a marriage built on love rather than necessity. Or they would get no heir from me at all. I meant it. I still mean it." What did she say? She said, he told me, something wry finding its way into his exhausted voice for the first time in weeks, that she had spent 20 years managing this family by always assuming duty would win. She said watching me choose you instead was the first time in 2 decades she'd seen someone in this family actually surprise her. I laughed. A real laugh. The first one I'd let myself have in 6 weeks, and felt for the first time since I'd packed that suitcase in the dead of night. Something like hope settle into the space where fear had been living. We did not return to Bishop Hall as it had been. Fernando restructured the board within the first month back, removing the advisors who had treated me like a liability, elevating people who understood that a dynasty which could not protect love inside its own walls was not a legacy worth protecting at all. Isolde stayed chastened and over the following months became unexpectedly one of the fiercest advocates I had, not out of guilt, I think, but out of genuine respect for a choice she hadn't believed either of us capable of making. Marcus did not stay. The particular ambitions he had cultivated in the months of my absence did not survive contact with a Fernando who had returned from that coastal town, changed, harder to manipulate, clearer about what he would and wouldn't sacrifice. Entirely unwilling to let anyone treat the family he was building as a mere continuation of the dynasty he'd inherited. We married in the greenhouse, the actual, literal greenhouse at Bishop Hall, the place where I had told him about the pregnancy, the place that had always belonged to no one's ledger but ours. It was small, exactly as small as Fernando had originally wanted before his family's expectations had threatened to swell it into a spectacle. Tutor stood beside his uncle looking prouder than I had ever seen a 12-year-old look, having appointed himself, without asking anyone's permission, as the officiant's unofficial assistant, correcting the celebrant's Latin pronunciation twice during the ceremony itself. Consuela came, flown in from the coastal town at Fernando's insistence, and cried through the entire thing in a way that made me cry too, both of us laughing at ourselves for it afterward. I wore no veil. I had spent enough of my life being hidden behind careful, discreet arrangements, behind the word tutors used instead of my name, behind a family's preference for managing me rather than seeing me. I wanted, on the one day that belonged entirely to the two of us and no one else's ledger, to be fully, unhidden, visible. Fernando cried too when he said his vows, a fact the staff would talk about for years afterward because, in 3 generations, no bishop had ever cried at anything in public. Least of all, a wedding meant to be a quiet, contained affair. He told me in front of the small gathering of people who actually mattered to us rather than the enormous crowd his family's old expectations would once have demanded, that he had spent his entire life believing love and duty were separate rooms in the same house, and that I had taught him they could be the same room. If you were brave enough to knock down the wall between them, I told him in return that I had spent my entire life believing I had to disappear to survive, disappear into smallness, into overachievement, into whatever shape the world demanded of an Omega who refused to be underestimated, and that he had taught me the opposite could also be true, that being fully seen, fully known, fully present was not a danger to survive, but a gift to finally accept. Our daughter was born on a spring morning, 11 weeks after the wedding, in a hospital room that Fernando had personally, obsessively made sure was staffed only by people he trusted completely, having learned the hard way exactly how much could go wrong when the people around you treated your family as a variable to be managed rather than a life to be honored. We named her Ines, after no one in particular, a small, deliberate rebellion against a family tradition of naming children after ancestors whose expectations they'd then spend their whole lives trying to live up to. Fernando held her first tears running freely down a face the world had only ever seen, composed and controlled, and said, in a voice thick with a wonder that had nothing to do with dynasties or mergers or 3 generations of prayers finally answered, "She doesn't have to inherit anything she doesn't want." "No," I agreed, holding both of them, feeling something in my chest finally, fully settle after a year of storms. She only has to inherit the fact that her parents chose each other, over and over, even when choosing each other cost them almost everything. Isolde visited within the week, and I watched her hold my daughter with a tenderness I hadn't known the woman was capable of. Something in her own carefully guarded face softened the way Fernando's had months earlier. In a hallway lit by lightning. I was wrong, she told me quietly, while Fernando was occupied elsewhere, in a rare moment of just the two of us. I told you this family had never let love survive intact. I should have told you, instead, that it had simply never had anyone brave enough to insist on it before. You did that. I hope you know what it cost you to be the first. I did know. I carry that cost with me still some nights, in the particular ache of remembering 6 weeks alone above a bakery, in the particular grief of understanding how close I came to raising my daughter in permanent, self-imposed exile from the man who loved us both more than his own dynasty. But I carry, alongside that cost, something larger. The knowledge that love, chosen deliberately, fought for honestly, rebuilt patiently after breaking, is not a weakness dynasties consume. It is the only thing, in the end, worth building a dynasty around at all. I still teach, though not as a tutor hired under discreet agency letters anymore. Fernando restructured a wing of Bishop Hall into a proper school years ago, open to children from the surrounding town, regardless of what their families could afford. Staffed by teachers who understand that brilliance and loneliness often arrive in the same small, insufferable 12-year-old package. Tutor, 17 now, and considerably less insufferable, though no less brilliant, helps teach Latin there on weekends, correcting younger students' pronunciation with an exacting patience he clearly learned from watching someone else do the same for him once. In a study lit gold by a dying afternoon. Ines is 4, fierce in the specific way children become fierce when they've never once had to earn the right to take up space. She asks questions I don't always have answers to, corrects her father's grammar with a confidence Tutor taught her, and falls asleep, most nights in the greenhouse, curled against whichever of us gets there first. In the one room of that enormous house that has always belonged to no one's ledger but ours, Fernando still runs an empire, though it looks different now than the one I first walked into on a rain-soaked night with a single suitcase and a folder of half-true credentials. He built new rooms into it, rooms for people the old dynasty would have called liabilities, rooms for choices the old machine would have consumed rather than protected. He still finds reasons most evenings to walk the length of the house just to find me the way he once found reasons to walk me to the East Wing after lessons ran late. Reasons that have nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with the pull between us. That's 6 years, 1 disappearance, 1 desperate search, and 1 impossibly small wedding have only ever deepened. I think about that first night often, the rain finding the cracks in me before it found the cracks in anything else, the certainty that Bishop Hall was either the beginning of something or the end of me. I understand now that it was both, in the way the truest things always are. The person who arrived at that house planning eventually to disappear. The way I had disappeared from every place that had ever asked too much of me and given too little in return, did, in a sense, vanish completely. What grew in his place was someone who finally believed, after 26 years of proving otherwise was necessary for survival, that he was allowed to stay, allowed to be fully seen, allowed to be loved by a man who had once run his entire life like a ledger and who had learned because of me, because of us, that the truest wealth a dynasty could ever hold was never going to be found in its accounts. It was going to be found in a greenhouse, in a small, unhidden wedding, in a daughter who never once had to earn her place, in a love that had been tested by disappearance and had chosen, against every fear either of us carried into it, to come home anyway. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.